The shoes weren't hers, and that was the detail Cora Bellamy kept circling back to, as she stood at the end of a candlelit hall in a Brooklyn mansion she'd never wanted to enter. They were borrowed heels half a size too small, sent over that morning by men in dark suits who didn't introduce themselves, and they'd already cut her heels raw by the time she reached the altar. She was 26, but the last 2 years had aged her in a way mirrors didn't show. Her mother gone to cancer, her father half paralyzed by a stroke and buried under medical debt he'd borrowed from the wrong family to pay, the little watch repair shop in Bensonhurst barely breathing. She'd dropped out of nursing school to keep them both alive, and now she was here, signing herself away to settle a ledger she never wrote a single line of. At the other end of the hall stood Jonah Fontaine, and everyone in that city already knew his name the way you know a storm before it arrives. 37 years old, the head of an empire built on debt and silence, a man who'd inherited his throne at 29, the night his father was gunned down in a parking garage, and hadn't smiled in public since. He was tall, dark hair pushed back from a face carved by exhaustion as much as by good blood, dressed in black that fit him like it had been poured on, his hands perfectly still in front of him. People said he was cruel, and they weren't wrong. What nobody had warned Cora about was the way he was looking at her right now, careful and quiet, like she was something he was trying very hard not to frighten. She'd braced herself for a cage. She'd rehearsed not crying in the back of a black town car with tinted windows. She hadn't prepared for the possibility that the most dangerous man in New York had read a file about a girl who'd once argued with his accountant for 40 straight minutes and won, and had decided, for reasons he wouldn't say out loud, that he wanted her at the end of this aisle. The contract said 1 year. Nobody in that room believed for a second it would be that simple, least of all the woman in the borrowed shoes whose hands were shaking and whose chin, somehow, refused to drop. If a story about a frightened woman and the cold man who surprised her is the kind of thing that pulls you in, do me a quick favor and hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a good slow burn, and to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that hall, those borrowed shoes, and the wedding night that changed everything. The bedroom was larger than the entire ground floor of the house she had grown up in, and Cora Bellamy stood in the middle of it like an object placed in the wrong room, her back pressed against the cold window frame, both hands clenched together in front of her stomach to hide their trembling. She counted silently in her head, 1, 2, 3, the childish little game she used to play when she was young, whenever her mother was taken into the emergency room and she had to sit waiting in the hallway, counting so she wouldn't think, counting so her chin wouldn't collapse. The door opened without a sound, and Jonah Fontaine stepped in, still wearing the black suit from the wedding. His tie loosened slightly, and she heard her heart pounding up into her throat. She had spent the entire past week building every worst possible scenario in her mind, preparing herself to endure, to stay silent, to turn herself into something so small that no one would even bother noticing. But he didn't move toward the bed. He walked around it, toward the armchair set close to the fireplace, the chair farthest from her in the room, and sat down there, unhurried, as though the distance between them was something he was deliberately choosing to keep. Cora didn't know what to do with that. In everything she had imagined, not once had she pictured this man placing himself far away from her by his own choice. He looked down at her feet, and his gaze stayed there so long that she lowered her eyes too, only then realizing that the borrowed shoes had cut into her heels until they bled, a thin red line already dried around the edge of her skin. She quickly drew 1 foot back as if hiding a mistake. He stood, walked to the low cabinet near the bathroom door, opened a drawer, and returned with a roll of cotton and a small bottle in his hand. Then he did something that made the entire room seem to hold its breath. He lowered himself to one knee in front of her, looked up, and asked very softly, "May I take your shoes off?" And Cora only nodded because she couldn't find her voice. His fingers were cold and steady, undoing the strap from her swollen heel with a strange care, as though she were something that might break if he hurried. He cleaned away the blood, dabbed on the medicine, wrapped a thin strip of bandage around her heel, and through all of it he didn't say another word, his hands calm and even, his lowered face revealing nothing. Cora stood still, her breath shallow, unable to understand why this small gesture made her eyes sting in a way even cruelty never had. When he was finished, he stood and stepped back exactly 1 pace, keeping the same distance as before. "You sleep in the bed," he said. "I'll take the chair." She opened her mouth, meaning to ask, meaning to try to understand the rules of the game she was certain must be hidden somewhere. But he spoke first, his voice low and quiet. "Nothing happens tonight that you don't want. That's all I'll say about this. You decide what that means." Then he returned to the chair, sat down, stretched out his legs, and looked into the fire as though no one else were in the room. Cora stood there for a long while, her hands still locked together, waiting for a trap to snap shut, waiting for his voice to change, waiting for the thing every story she had ever heard about men like him had promised. But nothing happened at all. There was only the crackle of the fire, and the wind beyond the glass, and the most dangerous man in New York sitting still in a chair across the room from her, not moving toward her in the slightest. At last, because her foot hurt, and because she no longer knew what she was standing there for, she climbed onto the bed that was too high and too wide, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and lay on her side so she could see him. She had planned to stay awake all night. She had been certain she would stay awake. A little while later, the door opened softly, and the woman named Marisol, the one who had led her up to the room earlier, stepped in and placed another pitcher of water on the bedside table. She looked at Cora, then glanced toward the chair where Jonah had closed his eyes, and when she turned to leave, she paused at the threshold and lowered her voice until it was almost only enough for Cora to hear. "I've been here for 8 years, sweetheart," she said. "He isn't what people say he is." Then the door closed, and Cora lay in the darkness, her heel carefully bandaged, her heartbeat slowing little by little, her eyes still open and fixed on the man sleeping in the chair. And she realized that the strange feeling rising in her chest was no longer fear, but something she didn't yet have a name for. Cora woke when the first light outside the glass was still a murky gray, and the first thing she realized was that the armchair beside the fireplace was empty. The thin blanket draped over the back of the chair had been folded neatly, the fire had burned down into cold embers, and Jonah Fontaine had left at some point without her knowing. She lay still for a while, listening, trying to find the sounds of a house keeping watch over her, footsteps in the hallway, locks, guards. But there was nothing at all, only the vast silence of a place too large for one person. She sat up, her heel still wrapped in bandage, and that bandage reminded her that last night hadn't been a dream. She walked to the bedroom door, placed her hand on the knob, and stopped for 1 beat, preparing herself for the feeling of the handle refusing to turn. But it turned lightly, and the door opened onto a long, silent hallway. Cora stood there, one hand still gripping the door, and a strange feeling rose inside her, one she hadn't expected. She had prepared herself to be. She had already built the image in her mind of iron bars, cold-faced men standing guard, a room with a lock on the outside, and yet the door opened, and no one stopped her. She stepped into the hallway, each step cautious, as though she were testing a sheet of thin ice that might crack at any moment. At the end of the hall, a tall man in a suit stood beside the staircase, and as she came closer, her heart pounded, waiting for an arm to block her way. But he only glanced at her once, gave a small nod, then looked away, as though her presence had nothing to do with him. She passed him, and no one followed. It was that very nothingness that unsettled her, more than the bars she had imagined, a cage she could understand. She knew how to fear it, knew how to find a way to live inside it. But a house with every door thrown open, while she still couldn't walk out through the gate because of her father, because of the debt, because of the signature she had put down. That was a kind of imprisonment she didn't yet have a name for. Freedom, but false freedom. A rope so long that people forgot the other end was still tied tight. She made her way downstairs, and the smell of coffee and toast led her to a large kitchen where Marisol was standing by the stove, her hair pinned neatly, her sleeves rolled high. The woman looked up at her without any surprise, as though she had already known Cora would eventually find her way down here. "He left before dawn," Marisol said, setting a cup of coffee on the table without asking whether she wanted it. "Something happened down by the harbor. He's always up before everyone else, and he sleeps less than a starving man eats." Cora sat down, wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, and for the first time in many days, allowed herself to let out a long breath. She didn't know what to say, so she stayed silent, and Marisol didn't push her. The woman simply went on with her work, tidying, wiping the table, until she stopped and looked at Cora with eyes that had softened a little from their earlier dryness. "A few boxes were delivered yesterday," she said. "He said to put them in the small room in the east wing, near the library. I think you should see them yourself." Cora's head lifted sharply. "What things?" Marisol shrugged, but there was something in her eyes as though she were hiding an answer larger than the one Cora had just heard. "Your things," she said. "And some old things too, things they said belonged to your mother." Cora went still, the coffee cup pausing halfway to her lips. Her mother's things. The things she had packed through tears 2 years ago, the things she had thought she would never touch again, were now lying in some room inside this house, brought here by order of the man the whole city called ruthless. She set the cup down, her hands trembling faintly, and a question rose inside her, growing larger, impossible to put out. What game the man who had slept in the chair last night, the man who had knelt to bandage her heel, was really playing, and why someone who owed her nothing would remember even the things she had never said aloud. The door to the small room in the east wing wasn't locked, just like every other door in this house, and when Cora pushed it open, the light flooded her eyes so suddenly that she had to stop at the threshold. It was the brightest room she had seen since setting foot here, with one wall almost entirely made of glass facing east, where the early sunlight poured in as warm golden bands stretching across the wooden floor. But it wasn't the light that made her go still, it was the table. Set close beside the window was a work table, and on it, arranged neatly down to the smallest detail, was every tool she used to repair watches. The eye loop with its worn leather cord, the tiny screwdrivers lined up from smallest to largest, the box of tweezers, the bottle of lubricating oil, the green leather mat faded by the years, even the old desk lamp she had thought she had left behind in the shop. Everything was there, not a single piece missing, and it had been placed the way a craftsperson would place it, not the careless way someone cleaning up would arrange things. Cora walked forward, one slow step at a time, as though the room might vanish if she moved too quickly. She reached out and touched the loop, then the screwdrivers, and her throat tightened. For more than 10 years, she had sat beside these things in the cramped little shop in Bensonhurst, learning from her father how to take a movement apart and put it back together again, learning how to listen to the ticking so she could tell whether a watch was healthy or sick. This was the only thing in the world that belonged to her in a way no one could fight her for, and now it was here, in the house of a stranger, brought back without anyone asking her a single question. Beside the tools was a small cardboard box, its lid already opened, and inside were the old things Marisol had mentioned, her mother's things, a faded scarf, a leather-bound notebook, a few photographs set in small wooden frames, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of felt, was her mother's pocket watch. Cora lifted it, and her hand trembled faintly. It was a tarnished brass watch, its glass face cracked through with one thin line, the engraving on the outer case worn almost smooth, an object worth little except for the value her heart had given it. It had been broken for a long time, had stopped running before her mother even fell ill, and though Cora had tried so many times, had taken it apart and put it back together more times than she could count, it still lay silent, its hands frozen at 12 and 3, as though the time inside it had stopped at some unknown moment no one could name. Her mother had once told her it had belonged to her grandfather. Then, another time said someone had left it with her father for safekeeping long ago. Scattered stories that Cora, as a child, had never bothered to hold on to. She pressed the watch into her palm, feeling its familiar weight, then placed it back on the table beside her tools, where she knew that one day she would open it again and try once more, as she always had. She stood in the middle of that sun-filled room for a long while, surrounded by everything that remained of her old life, and tried to understand what all of this meant. A man had married her to erase a debt, a man who didn't need to do anything more than keep her inside 4 walls for a year, and then send her back. That man had sent people all the way to her family's little shop, had packed every screwdriver, every photograph, every keepsake of a dead mother, and brought it all here, placing it in a room with the most beautiful light in the house, and he hadn't said a word to her about it. When Cora left the room to find him, to ask him what any of this meant, the guard at the staircase told her the boss still hadn't returned and wouldn't be back until evening. So she went back, sat down in the chair beside the work table, placed her hands on her tools, and for the first time inside this strange house, she felt a little less out of place. though she still couldn't understand why. Cora sat at the work table for most of the morning, taking apart and reassembling an old wristwatch she had found in a drawer. Not because it needed repair, but because her hands needed something to do. When she heard unhurried footsteps in the hallway and then a young voice at the threshold, "So you found the room?" She looked up and saw a young man leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, arms folded across his chest, watching her with open curiosity and not the slightest trace of hostility. He was much younger than Jonah, perhaps only in his early 20s, with a softer, more open face, wearing an expensive suit in the careless way of someone who had never had to worry about anything. "I'm Theodore," he said, then grimaced as if the name itself annoyed him. "But don't call me that. It sounds like an old man's name. Everyone calls me Teddy. Jonah's brother, technically his half-brother, and the different mother part is what makes me much funnier than he is." He stepped inside, dropped into the chair across from her, with the lazy posture of someone who had never once had to sit properly, and looked around the sun-filled room, at the tools on the table, then back at her. "He didn't tell you about me, did he?" Cora shook her head. "He doesn't tell me about anything." Teddy laughed, a short, genuine sound. "That sounds exactly like him. My brother believes information given too quickly is information that isn't properly valued. He turns everything into a test without even trying to. It's his worst flaw, or one of them." He tapped his fingers against the arm of the chair, glanced toward the door, then looked back at her with a mischievous expression. "Do you know he told people to watch whether you came into this room?" Cora froze, the tweezers in her hand stopping halfway through the motion. "What?" "This room," Teddy said, lifting his chin toward the tools. "He had all your things brought here, arranged everything in place, then told them that if you stepped inside, they should let him know." He shrugged as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He wanted to know whether you would find your way to it. I think he's been restless all morning waiting for word." Cora set the tweezers down, a strange feeling rising in her chest, half discomfort at being watched, half confusion because the reason for that watching was so gentle she didn't know where to place it. "Why does he care about that?" she asked. Teddy looked at her for a long while, and for the first time, the teasing expression on his face settled into something more serious. "Because he doesn't know how to ask whether you're all right," he said. "He doesn't know how to do gentle things. He never learned. So he does it his way. He brings your old life back and puts it in a beautiful room, then waits to see whether you want to touch it. That's how he asks whether you're all right without having to open his mouth." He paused, then went on, his voice quieter. "He didn't sleep last night. I know because I got up at midnight. After you fell asleep, he came out and sat in the hallway right outside your door for the rest of the night. He didn't want to disturb you, so he just kept watch there until dawn." Cora felt her throat tighten. She had thought Jonah had slept in the chair inside the room all night, but now she understood that perhaps he had gone outside after she fell asleep and sat guard before her door like a silent sentinel. "Why?" she asked again, the word almost only a breath. "That's what he does when he doesn't know what else to do," Teddy replied. "He keeps watch. When he doesn't know how to comfort someone, he protects them. It's the only language he knows." He stood, stretched, and walked to the door, then turned back to look at her one last time with a half-smile returning to his mouth. "He isn't a warm man," Teddy said. "He doesn't do gentle things easily because no one ever taught him how. But in his whole life, he hasn't once done anything that wasn't meant to protect someone he considered his responsibility. And now he considers you his responsibility. Give him time to learn how to talk to you. He's trying." Then he was gone, leaving Cora sitting alone in the sun-filled room, her mother's tools in front of her, and the fragile, strange, completely unexpected feeling of something that had only just begun. Jonah returned after night had fully fallen, and Marisol told Cora that dinner would be served in the small dining room beside the library, instead of the great hall. A detail Cora didn't fully understand until she stepped inside and saw only two place settings arranged at one corner of the table, close together, beneath the warm light. Jonah was already seated there, wearing that familiar stillness, and when she entered he stood, a small gesture that made her pause because she hadn't expected it. They sat across from each other, and for a long while, neither of them said anything. Marisol brought in the food, stew and bread still warm, and Cora realized he barely touched his own plate. only drinking something dark from his glass, and occasionally watching her eat from the corner of his eye. She had eaten halfway through her meal when she set down her fork, unable to bear the silence any longer, and asked directly the thing that had weighed on her all day. Why me? He looked up at her. What are you asking? Why did you choose me? Cora said, her voice steadier than she had expected. There's an entire city out there. There are families who owe you more than my father does, women prettier than me, more obedient than me, women who understand this world better than I do. I'm just the daughter of a watch repairman in Bensonhurst. So why me? Jonah set his glass down, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat again into the silence she was slowly beginning to recognize as his fortress. But then he spoke. 12 families were considered, he said. 3 names made the final list. My men recommended someone else, older than you, better connected, from a family with long-standing ties to my business. On paper, she was the far more logical choice. Cora waited, her heart beating slow and heavy. I read every person's file, he continued, his eyes fixed on her with the carefulness she had begun learning to read. In your file, there was one line. It said that when my debt collection officer came to the shop to review the books, you made him a cup of tea, then argued with him for 40 minutes about an error in his interest calculation that he'd made 3 years earlier. And you were right. The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she had glimpsed the night before. I found that interesting. Cora stared at him, unable to believe it. You chose me because I argued with a debt collector. I chose you because you aren't afraid of being right, Jonah replied, and there was no teasing in his voice at all. In my world, everyone tells me what they think I want to hear. Everyone measures every word in front of me, calculating what to say in order to gain something, what to leave unsaid in order to stay safe. It's been a very long time since I met someone willing to say something true out loud, no matter how powerful the person listening might be. That's much rarer than you think, in anyone. Cora sat there in silence, not knowing how to answer, and to cover that empty space, she turned to the only part of this whole story she still couldn't understand. That cup of tea, she said slowly. That debt collector, he came to review my father's debt. I still don't understand that debt. My father borrowed the money to pay for my mother's treatment. I know that. But something about the timing keeps feeling wrong to me, as if the number had already started growing before my mother got sick. She shook her head, brushing the thought aside, the way one brushes away a strand of hair from the face, because it was too vague, too distant, and because she didn't want to dig any deeper into the debt that had brought her all the way here. I'm probably remembering it wrong, she said. Everything was such a mess back then. Jonah didn't answer right away. There was a very brief silence, so brief almost no one would have noticed it, and in that instant his eyes darkened a little, like the surface of a lake after something has sunk to the bottom. Then he picked up his glass, and the conversation drifted in another direction. Finish your food, he said softly. Marisol spent all afternoon making this, and she'll take it personally if she sees you leave it. Cora picked up her fork, and for the first time since setting foot inside this house, she finished everything on her plate, beneath the warm light, across from a man she was beginning, slowly and dangerously, to no longer fear. The evenings gradually took on a shape Cora hadn't expected. The 5th day, then the 8th, and every evening Jonah came to wherever she was, whether it was the small dining room or the library, sat down across from her, and they talked. They weren't easy conversations, not at once, but little by little, like water dripping until it wore down stone. The distance between them grew thinner. One evening, sitting in the library with the fire crackling softly, she told him about her mother. About her mother's hands, always rough and carrying the scent of flour mingled with machine oil, because she helped in the shop and took in sewing work on the side. About the smell of watch lubricating oil that Cora had known since before she could walk, that faintly sweet metallic smell that to anyone else was only the smell of chemicals, but to her was the smell of childhood, of afternoons sitting beside her father, learning how to lift a gear as small as the head of a needle. She told him that she had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, had almost finished the nursing program, had memorized how to place an intravenous line, how to listen to a heartbeat, how to stay calm when the person in front of her was panicking. Then her mother fell ill, then her father had a stroke, and she had folded that dream away, tucked it into a drawer along with so many other things, so she could come home and carry the shop and the 2 people she loved. I don't regret it, she said, though her voice trembled faintly. I just sometimes wonder what became of that girl, the version of me who got to finish school. Jonah listened in the way he always listened, with his whole face, not impatiently waiting for his turn to speak, and when she stopped, he stayed silent for a while before he spoke. My father was shot to death in a parking lot when I was 29, he said, and it was the first time he had told her something about himself without her needing to ask. I was 2 blocks away. I heard it over the phone, and by the time I got there, it was already over. A week later, I sat in his chair, and I've been sitting there ever since, 8 years now. He turned the glass in his hand, looking into the fire. People think power is freedom, he said. It isn't. Power is a room everyone looks into, and no one steps inside with you. You make decisions that affect thousands of people, and you make them alone, every day, for 8 years. You forget what it feels like to have someone sitting across from you who doesn't want anything from you at all. Cora looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not a crime lord, not the man the whole city feared, but only a person who had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten he had ever been anything else. She didn't know what to say to soothe that, so she didn't try. She only sat with him in silence, and that silence no longer felt as heavy as it had in the first days. A while later, as if to pull herself out of the deep place they had just touched, she went on telling him about the shop, about the broken little memories of a child who had grown up among clocks, and then an old memory rose to the surface, a piece she had forgotten for a long time. When I was little, she said slowly, sometimes strangers came to the shop at night, after closing. I remember lying upstairs, hearing a soft knock at the door 3 times, then my father going down to open it. They would leave things with him, little packages, then go right away, never staying. In the morning, when I asked, my father said they were regular customers leaving valuable watches with him because they were afraid someone might steal them at home. She gave a soft laugh and shook her head. I believed it right away back then. I was a child. Children believe whatever they're told. Jonah didn't laugh with her. He sat very still, the kind of stillness she was slowly learning to tell apart, and in that moment his eyes looked distant, as though he were seeing something from a very long time ago, something she couldn't see. Then he blinked, and that look disappeared. And he asked her in a voice light as air whether she wanted to hear about the first time he saw snow fall, in a country that no longer carried the same name. And Cora nodded, letting the old memory of the nighttime visitors sink back down to the bottom, where it had lain still for so many years. One late afternoon, Jonah came home earlier than usual, and Cora knew at once from the way he entered the library that this had been a bad day. He said nothing, only lowered himself into the chair across from her, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes, and in that posture she saw an exhaustion that even his familiar stillness couldn't hide. A weariness carved around his eyes and settled in his shoulders. She set down the book she had been reading. "Bad day?" she asked. "People from the other side came," he answered without opening his eyes. "They wanted things I couldn't give them without creating a precedent that would take decades to undo. I refused them in 7 different ways, and they still demanded an 8th. In the end, I invited them to leave." Cora looked at him for a while, then stood without saying anything. In the corner of the library was a small cabinet where Marisol kept a few things for making tea and coffee, something Cora herself had asked to have placed there during the first week, because a girl raised in Brooklyn couldn't live without a decent cup of coffee. She set the kettle on the little stove, took out the fin and the packet of coffee, measured out each spoonful, and while the water slowly heated, she stood there with both hands occupied, grateful to have something to do. When she turned back, Jonah had opened his eyes and was watching her, both eyes fixed on her, attentive in a way that made her blush slightly. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he replied, but he kept looking at her for another moment. "No one has ever made coffee for me before." Cora froze with the coffee pot in her hand. "Can you drink coffee?" she asked, suddenly realizing she had never seen him eat or drink anything in front of her except the dark liquid in his glass. "I've never seen you eat anything." "I can," he said. "I just don't have the habit. It's been a long time since anyone sat at the table with me long enough for something like that to become a habit." She stood there, and suddenly she understood that the sentence wasn't about coffee, had never been about coffee at all. She poured the glossy black liquid into a cup, made it strong the way she liked it, then brought it over and set it on the small table beside his chair. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. and the way he said it made her know he was thanking her for something much larger than a cup of coffee. She returned to her own chair, tucked her legs beneath her, and opened her book, but she didn't read. She watched from the corner of her eye as he picked up the cup, lifted it close to his face, breathed in the warm, rich scent as though it were something unfamiliar, then took a small sip. He said nothing about the taste. He only held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth soak into his palms, and Cora understood that to him, the cup wasn't meant for drinking. It was something someone had made for him, only for him, without asking anything in return, and perhaps it had been many years since anyone had done anything like that. "Why did you make it for me?" he asked after a while, his voice quiet, his eyes still lowered to the coffee cup. Cora shrugged, turning back to the page. "Because you had a bad day," she said, "and because someone should." He lifted his eyes to her, and this time that almost smile stayed on his lips longer than it ever had before, fuller, nearly becoming a real smile. The kind of smile she felt had been asleep inside him for years, and was now hesitantly testing whether it was still allowed to appear. It lasted only a few seconds before he put it away, as he always did, but she had seen it, and something inside her chest loosened by exactly one notch, only a small notch, but real, and she knew that from now on she would never be able to forget that nearly formed smile, or the strange feeling that she had just touched something very few people had ever been allowed to touch. The woman appeared on the 11th day, without warning, and Cora knew at once that she was important from the way the entire house seemed to shift slightly when she stepped inside. She had come for a dinner with several people from the business world, and she sat 3 places away from Jonah with the easy bearing of someone who had sat in rooms like this hundreds of times before. She was beautiful in a way that made it difficult to look away, with glossy black hair, a tall figure, and a sharply tailored suit worn by a lawyer who knew exactly what she was worth. She looked at Cora only once, briefly, with a polite and empty gaze, then turned away and began speaking to Jonah in a low voice about something Cora couldn't quite hear. Cora ate her portion and tried to keep her face calm, but a strange, unpleasant feeling kept rising inside her, something she didn't want to name. An hour later, when she left the dinner table, Marisol appeared at her elbow and said very softly, "That woman is Priya Anand. She used to be Jonah's many years ago. Now she works as a lawyer for the other side. She's only here for business." Cora nodded as though that meant nothing at all, then went to the library and sat down, staring at the fire for a long time. She wasn't jealous, she told herself. She absolutely wasn't jealous. She had been this man's wife for 11 days. She had no right to be jealous of anything. But she was 26 and he was 37, and the years he had once shared with that woman were almost an entire lifetime she couldn't reach. And what was she doing here? Sitting in his library, looking at his fire, carrying feelings inside her that she had no frame to put around. When Jonah found her later, she was still holding a book upside down without even realizing it. He sat down, looked at the book, then looked at her. "Marisol told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "She thought I should know," Cora replied. "She was right." He was silent for a while. "Priya and I ended 2 years ago. She's here because she sits on the council for the other side, and the dispute I'm handling falls within her area. It's business." "You don't owe me an explanation," Cora said, though inside she knew how badly she wanted to hear it. "I know I don't owe one," he replied, his eyes steady and direct on hers. "I'm choosing to give one." She set the book down, this time right side up. "Did you love her?" she asked, because she was not someone who knew how to speak in circles, and she wasn't about to start learning now. Something passed over his face, quick and complicated. "I cared about her once," he said. "That was real. But love, I'm not certain I understood what that word meant before it was over. I think for a very long time, I mistook stability for love. I had someone beside me, a pleasant order to things, and I called it love because I didn't know what else it could be." He stopped. "It wasn't until I lost it that I realized what I missed wasn't the person, but the quietness of having someone there." Cora looked at him for a long time. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. "It was," he replied. She believed him, and strangely, that eased the unpleasant feeling still lingering inside her. "You sleep here tonight," he said when he stood, and just like that, the night moved on. The next morning, when Cora stepped into the hallway, she found Priya Anand preparing to leave, her suitcase by her feet as she waited for the car. The woman looked at her, and this time her gaze wasn't empty anymore. She looked at Cora for a long while, from head to toe, not with the hostility of a rival, but with something Cora couldn't read, an assessment, almost a warning left unspoken. "You're young," Priya finally said, her voice quiet and flat, "and you don't belong to this world." She paused as though she meant to say something more, her lips parting before closing again, and the thing she didn't say hung suspended between them. "Be careful what you believe is true here," she said at last, then turned away as the car pulled up, leaving Cora standing alone in the hallway, with a new uneasiness she didn't yet understand. Priya's warning lingered in Cora's mind for several days afterward, a thin thread of unease she couldn't pull loose, and perhaps that was why she couldn't sleep that night. It was well past midnight, and she lay in bed listening to the wind beyond the glass, then to the sound of engines rising from the courtyard below, many cars arriving at the same time, an unusual sound at that hour. She should have stayed still. Later, when she thought back on it, she knew she should have stayed in bed, closed her eyes, and let his world keep turning beyond her sight, as it always did. But she was thirsty, and the pitcher on the table was empty, so she put on her robe and stepped into the hallway, intending to go down to the kitchen for water. The house was dark and silent, with only a few wall lamps still burning, and she descended the stairs on bare feet without a sound. When she neared the bottom step, she heard voices, low and urgent, drifting from Jonah's study at the end of the hallway, the door left slightly open, letting out a strip of yellow light. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had only meant to pass by. But that partly open door revealed a small slice of the room, and Cora looked in, and what she saw made her freeze in the dark corridor. There were several men inside, faces she had never seen before, and the air in the room was stretched tight as a wire about to snap. A man sat slumped in a chair, his head bowed low, while the others stood around him with the posture of men who had just finished doing something heavy. Cora didn't see clearly what had happened, and later she would be grateful for that. Grateful that the door had been open only by a narrow crack, grateful that the darkness had hidden part of it. But she saw enough. She saw enough to understand that something brutal had just taken place in that room. Something that belonged to the world. The whole city still whispered about when it spoke of him. The world she had almost forgotten was real, during evenings of reading books and cups of coffee. And then she saw Jonah. He stood partly turned away from the door, saying something to the others in a low, cold voice she had never heard him use, a voice with nothing in it of the man who had knelt to bandage her heel. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and under the yellow light, Cora saw it. Blood, a dark stain spreading across the cuff of his white sleeve, across the back of his hand, blood that wasn't his, and he looked at it with the chilling calm of someone far too used to seeing it. Cora's whole body went cold. Her heart pounded up into her ears, and for one moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, only stood there in the dark hallway, looking into the truth she had been trying not to look at for more than 10 days. The man who had joked with her over a cup of coffee, the man who had brought her entire old life back and placed it in a sun-filled room, the man who had sat guard outside her door through a long night. That man was also the man standing in that room with blood on his hands and a voice that could freeze the very air. Both of those men were one person. She had known that. She had always known. But knowing something with the mind and seeing it with the eyes were two completely different things, and now she was seeing it. One of the men in the room looked up, as though he had sensed something, and Cora didn't wait another second. She stepped back, once, then turned, and she ran. She ran back up the stairs. Her bare feet struck the cold stone steps and her robe flew behind her. She wasn't thinking about whether she was making noise. She thought of nothing, except putting as much distance as possible between herself and that room. She rushed into her bedroom, slammed the door shut, leaned her back against it, and stood there in the dark with her breath breaking apart and her heart pounding as if it might burst. Both trembling hands pressed hard against her mouth to hold back a sob she didn't know was rising because of fear, because of disillusionment, or because of something more painful than both of those things combined. The knock came when dawn was almost breaking. Soft, 2 knocks, then silence. Cora had spent the entire night sitting on the floor, her back against the foot of the bed, and she didn't answer. "Don't come in," she said, her voice hoarse. "I won't come in," Jonah's voice came through the door, low and tired. "I'm only standing here. You don't have to open the door." A long silence followed. "You saw," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Cora replied. She heard him let out a long breath. Then the rustle of clothing as he sat down on the hallway floor on the other side of the door, as though if she wouldn't let him in, he would sit right there, with only a layer of wood between them. Finally, because she couldn't bear talking to a door, because some part of her needed to see his face when he spoke, she stood and opened it. He looked up at her from the floor, and he had changed his shirt, his hands were clean, but his face could no longer hide anything, every layer of defense having fallen away from exhaustion. "I won't tell you that what you saw wasn't what it looked like," he said. "I won't make up a story to make you feel better. You deserve to hear the truth, even if that truth makes you afraid of me." Cora leaned against the doorframe, both arms crossed over her chest as if holding herself together. "Then tell the truth," she said. "There are things I've done that I can't make right," Jonah said, not avoiding her eyes. "There are things I've ordered, things I've done with my own hands, and if I told you I regretted all of them, I would be lying, because some of them were things that had to be done to keep the people who belong to me alive. I'm not a good man, Cora. I've never told you I was a good man. I won't start lying about that now." Cora swallowed. "The man in that room," she said. He looked at her. "He betrayed me," he said. "He sold information about me to people who want me dead, information that, if it reached the right place, would cost not only me but innocent people who work for me. I dealt with it. I won't tell you the details, because I don't want those images inside your head. But I want you to know this." He stopped, and his voice softened. "I have never harmed an innocent person. In 8 years sitting in that chair, I've done many dark things, but I've never touched someone who didn't step into this world by choice. That is my line. That is what separates me from my father." Cora looked at him, and she saw something in the way he said "my father," an old wound that had never healed. "Your father didn't have that line," she said softly. "My father had no lines at all," Jonah replied. "I grew up watching him do things I still haven't told anyone about. And every day for the past 8 years, I've been afraid I'll become him, afraid that chair will eat away at me until there's no difference left. I'm trying, Cora. I'm trying every day not to become what I was taught to become. That is all I can say." She stood still for a long while, and she didn't rush to forgive him, didn't rush into his arms, because she wasn't that kind of person, and because what she had seen couldn't be erased by a single explanation, no matter how sincere it was. But she didn't run anymore either. "I need you to understand one thing," she said slowly, her voice growing steadier. "I can't pretend your world doesn't exist. I won't lie to myself like that. But I also don't believe a person is defined completely by the worst thing they've ever done. I think people are more complicated than that. I think you are more complicated than that." She looked straight into his eyes. "But that doesn't mean you're exempt from responsibility. Both things can be true. You may not be the monster people say you are, and still have to carry what you've done. I need you to know that this is how I see you. Both parts. I won't close my eyes to either one." Jonah looked at her from the floor, and in his eyes was something she had never seen before. Relief mixed with pain, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at him clearly enough to see both parts at once, and been brave enough to say it aloud. "I know," he said softly, "and I'll never ask you to close your eyes." The days after that night passed in a gentle caution between them, neither of them rushing, neither pretending that everything had returned to what it had been, but neither of them retreating either. And then one afternoon, while Jonah was still in a meeting downstairs, Cora carried a book she had borrowed down to return it to his study, the room she had avoided since that night, but which was now empty and filled with sunlight. Nothing like the darkness it held in her memory. She meant only to set the book down and leave at once. But on his desk, piled high with his papers, among maps and letters and contracts, there was a thick file lying open, not turned face down, not hidden, simply resting there among everything else. And she saw her name at the top of the page. Cora should have put the book down and walked out. She knew that. But she read. The first page was about her father's debt, and as her eyes moved along the lines, she had to place one hand on the desk to keep herself standing. The debt had been erased. Not postponed, not stretched out, but wiped away entirely, all of it, paid quietly through layers of companies she didn't fully understand. But the result was numbingly clear. Her father no longer owed anyone a single cent. The next page made her throat tighten even more. It was about her mother, about the old hospital bills, and about a third-party collection agency that had bought that medical debt and was still preparing to pursue it, with her mother's medical records attached like a weapon. Jonah had stopped them. He had bought back that debt before he ever married her, had sealed her mother's medical records, so no one could ever again use the pain of a dead woman to threaten her daughter. Cora had never told him about that third-party collector. She had never told anyone. She turned to another page, and this was a list, written in Jonah's own handwriting, that precise, slightly angular script she had glimpsed before on other scraps of paper. It was a list of people who could harm her, each name followed by a way to neutralize that person, cold and meticulous as a military plan. But tucked among those cold calculations were other notes, written smaller, as if he had written them only for himself, and it was those lines that made her heart tighten. Beside one item he had written, "Don't use money as the answer to everything, she hates that." Beside another, "She doesn't like being pitied, don't let this look like pity." And at the bottom of the page, there was a line that had been crossed out and rewritten, then crossed out again, as though he had struggled to find the right words and couldn't ask her what makes her feel safe, don't guess. Cora stood there in the sun-filled room, the file trembling in her hands, and she understood. She understood that all these days, while she had been trying to decipher him, he had also been trying to decipher her, not to control her, but to protect her from dangers she didn't even know existed. The man who didn't know how to ask whether she was all right had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had silently cleared away every threat around her, one by one, in silence, never expecting her to know. His language of love wasn't words. It was meticulous protection in the dark. It was this 4-page list. It was him writing down the things that frightened her and finding ways to remove them one by one, like taking apart every tiny gear in a broken movement. She didn't hear the door, but she knew he had returned, knew by the particular silence that arrived before him. "I brought the book down to return it," she said without turning around, her voice thick, a pause. "I know," he said softly from the doorway. "I didn't mean to find this," she said, placing her hand on the pages. "I know." She turned around and her eyes were wet, though she didn't allow a single tear to fall. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why did you do all this without saying a word?" Jonah stood at the threshold, still in the coat he had just worn back from the road, and he looked at her with that familiar carefulness, the look of someone deciding how much emotion he was allowed to reveal in front of another person. "I'm not good at saying things like this," he finally replied. "Writing them down is how I make sure I do them right. I didn't know how to ask whether I could take care of you, so I just did it." And Cora, standing in the sun-filled room with her whole life, silently sheltered in the hands of a stranger, realized that the thing rising in her chest at that moment finally had a name. The woman came on a morning of the season's first snow, without warning, and Cora knew who she was before she even introduced herself, knew from the way she walked, from the absolute economy in every movement, not a single motion wasted, the bearing of someone who had sat in countless rooms and found none of them worth her concern. She was tall, her silver hair pinned neatly, dressed in an expensive but understated dark blue suit, and her eyes were the same color as Jonah's, though entirely different in expression. "You're Cora," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Cora replied, setting down her pen. "I'm Catherine, Jonah's mother." She stepped into the sun-filled room where Cora sat at the work table, lowered herself into the chair by the window, with the calm of someone who had never felt out of place anywhere, and looked at Cora with a direct, undisguised assessment. "He didn't tell you I was coming," Catherine said. "No," Cora replied. "He didn't tell me he had become attached." She paused on that word, choosing it carefully, attached, saying it in a neutral voice, and that neutrality was more uncomfortable than if she had spoken it with disapproval. "I came to see for myself," Catherine said. "See what?" Cora asked, keeping her voice calm. Catherine's eyes sharpened slightly. "See why a 26-year-old girl from a watch repair shop has my 37-year-old son writing lists." Cora went still. "You know about the lists," Theodore told me, Catherine said. "That boy tells me everything. It's his best and worst habit." She looked at Cora for a long while. "Jonah has never written lists about people. He writes lists about problems, about territory disputes, about business failures, about political complications. In his entire life, I've never seen him write a single list about a person." She stopped. "He wrote 4 pages about how not to frighten you." "I know," Cora said softly. "I read them." Something moved across Catherine's face. Not exactly surprise, more like a refocusing. "And what do you think of them?" "I think it's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me," Cora replied, and she didn't lower her voice, didn't look away. "That's all." Silence. Catherine looked at her for a long time, the look of someone searching for something specific, either finding it or not. He isn't an easy man, Catherine finally said. You understand that, don't you? I've realized, Cora answered. He has been sitting in that chair since he was 29 years old. That shapes a person. He is used to every problem having an answer, and used to being the one who finds that answer. But people are harder. People can't be solved like equations. Catherine studied Cora closely. He's getting better at that, with you, which means he's trying. And that is precisely what worries me. Cora frowned. Why does that worry you? Because it's been a very long time since he has allowed himself to try, Catherine said, her voice not cruel, only exact. The last time he let himself truly try was with Priya. And when that ended, he closed some door inside himself, and I thought he would never open it again. She looked steadily at Cora. I didn't come here to tell you to stay away from him. I came to ask you to be careful with what he is giving you, because he doesn't give that easily, and he won't survive it well if you change your mind. Cora sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the snow fell steadily, thick and silent. I won't change my mind, she said. I can't promise you certainty about things I don't fully understand myself yet, but I can tell you that I don't take this lightly. I don't take him lightly. Catherine looked at her for another long moment. Then she nodded, exactly once, the same kind of nod Cora had seen in Jonah whenever he had just reached a decision. Good, she said. And in that one brief, precise word, Cora heard something almost like approval. After Catherine left, Jonah came to Cora with a hesitation she had never seen in him before, both hands tucked into his pockets, standing at the threshold of the sunlit room as though he wasn't certain he was allowed to enter. My mother ambushed you, he said. She came to see me, Cora corrected. She came to assess you, Jonah replied. Same thing. The corner of his mouth moved, but there was something different in him today, a restlessness, and then he said, Come with me, I want to show you something. He led her down a hallway she had never taken before, to a narrow spiral staircase that climbed higher than she expected, and at the very top was a small room that made Cora place one hand against the wall to steady herself the moment she stepped inside. It was an attic room, with windows opening on all four sides, and beyond them stretched a whole white sea of snow, reaching all the way to the foot of the distant hills. But it wasn't the view outside that left her silent. It was what was inside. There was a work table set close to the window that faced south, where the sunlight was strongest, and on it lay a brand new set of tools, more complete than her old one had ever been, the finest tools she had only ever dared to dream of owning. There was a soft chair, a desk lamp with a gentle glow, a small shelf for arranging watches, and beside the window, resting on a piece of felt, was her mother's old pocket watch, somehow already brought up here. What have you done? Cora asked, her voice quiet. This was my mother's room, years ago, Jonah said, standing behind her. She came here the same way you did, from outside this world, and during those first months, this was the only place she would come. She said it was the only place where she still felt like herself. I've kept it empty for years. I thought, he stopped, searching for the words in that careful way of his. I thought you should have a place of your own, a place that isn't mine, and isn't this house's, a place where you can breathe. Cora turned to look at him, and her eyes blurred. Of all the things he had done, the debts quietly erased, the dangers cleared away in the dark, nothing touched her as deeply as this, a room filled with sunlight where she was allowed to be herself, given to her not as a gift meant to buy her, but as an acknowledgement that she was a person who needed somewhere to belong. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, he replied. They stood there, closer than usual, closer than the distance he had always kept between them, and Cora looked up at his face. At that stillness she no longer found cold but had begun to find solid, like something built to last, and she realized she didn't want that distance anymore. She didn't know exactly when it had happened, somewhere between the story about the teacup and the 4-page list and his hands bandaging her heel on that first night, and the almost smile he always tried to put away. Somewhere in those days, fear had turned into something else, something with an entirely different texture. You always let me decide the distance, she said softly, lifting her eyes to his. Yes, he answered, his voice lower. Then let me decide this time, she said. And she was the one who closed that distance, the one who set a hand against his chest and rose onto her toes, the one who defined the shape of this kiss, without hesitation, without searching for permission, only honest. For one moment he stood completely still, as though he couldn't believe it, And then his arms came around her and he kissed her back. And beneath all his familiar restraint, she felt the weight of it. The weight of a man who had been lonely in ways she was only beginning to understand. And that man, here in this sun-filled room, was no longer lonely. When they drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, and she felt that his breathing was no longer as even as it always was. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, still leaving the choice to her, right up to the final second. "I'm sure," Cora answered. And outside the window, the snow kept falling, white against the darkened sky, silently covering an entire world that for the first time had begun to feel like home to her. The days that followed were the quietest days Cora had known since setting foot in this house, a rare stretch of stillness she would later remember with a tender ache, because she had no idea it would be so brief. Jonah seemed lighter, as though he had just set down a burden he had carried for far too long. He smiled more, not the full smile she still rarely got to see, but that almost smile now appeared so often that she began to think of it as hers. And then something new happened. One evening, he brought a stack of business papers down to the library, sat across from her, and instead of working in silence as he always had, he slid one sheet toward her and asked what she thought of it. Cora froze, thinking she must have heard him wrong. "You're asking for my opinion." "I'm asking for your opinion," Jonah replied. "You see people in numbers more clearly than I thought. What do you think the board on the other side really wants?" And she told him what she thought, plainly, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, and he listened with his whole face the way he always listened, not pretending, but truly weighing her words. It was a form of intimacy greater, even than the kiss in the attic, this act of letting her step into a part of his life he had never allowed anyone to enter. One afternoon, as they passed through the main hallway, where servants and several of his men were moving back and forth, he took her hand and laced his fingers through hers, as naturally as breathing. Right in the middle of a place where everyone could see, something he had never done before, because until then he had only ever touched her in closed rooms. Cora looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, and he kept his gaze straight ahead, his face calm, but his thumb brushed once across the back of her hand, quietly, like a period at the end of a sentence. She understood, and she tightened her fingers around his. It was on one such peaceful evening, while Cora was helping him review a stack of ledgers brought in by his right-hand man, a man named Ray Doyle, that her mind, so used to numbers, caught on something. She stopped, turned back to the previous page, then turned forward again, comparing the two columns of figures, and a crease appeared between her brows. "Something doesn't match," she said softly, almost only to herself. Jonah looked up. "What?" "These numbers," Cora said, tapping her finger on the page. "The transfer here doesn't line up with the receipt on the next page. It's off by just a little, only a small amount, but it's off every month, in the same direction, as though someone is drawing out a little at a time, and covering it with numbers that look reasonable." She shook her head, then gave a small laugh and brushed it away. "I'm probably seeing it wrong. I'm not used to this kind of accounting." But Jonah didn't laugh with her. He took the page, looked at the numbers she had just pointed out, and something very slight changed in his face, a stillness deeper than his usual stillness, the kind of stillness that belonged to a man who had just heard a wrong note in a piece of music he should have known by heart. He said nothing, only folded the sheet and set it aside, but Cora saw that he had remembered it, stored it somewhere inside his mind. That night, after she had returned to her room and was getting ready for bed, her phone lit up, the phone Jonah had given her during the first week, with a number she didn't recognize. Cora picked it up and read the message, and her whole body went cold. "Don't trust everyone closest to him," the message said. "Someone in the house isn't what they pretend to be. Be careful for your own sake." There was no signature, but something in the wording, in that cold directness, made Cora think at once of the woman who had stood in the hallway and told her to be careful about what she believed was true. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone in her hand, her heart beating slow and heavy, and she thought of the mismatched numbers in the ledger, of the way Jonah's face had changed, and a vague unease began to tighten around her, not fear of him this time, but fear for him. Cora showed the message to Jonah the very next morning, and he stared at it for a long time, his face unchanged, though she could see something moving behind those eyes, fast and cold. He had already had people tracing the mismatched numbers in the ledger all night. By noon, he had the answer, and the answer tilted his entire world off balance. It was Ray Doyle. His right-hand man, the man who had stood beside him for nearly 10 years, the man he had once trusted more than his own brother. Those mismatched numbers were money flowing out, a little at a time, for months, flowing straight into the pocket of his greatest enemy, Victor Vassal. The name was spoken in Jonah's study like a stone thrown into a still pond. Vassal, the head of the rival family, the man who had spent years hungering to swallow the Fontaine territory whole, and Ray had been working for him. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst came when Priya Anand appeared at the gate that afternoon, alone, without warning, without a suitcase, without the cold lawyer's composure she had worn the last time. She came with the face of a woman who had just decided to do something that could get her killed. "I sent her the message," Priya said, her eyes fixed straight on Jonah. "I couldn't stand by and watch anymore." And then she told them. She spoke in a flat, rapid voice, as though if she stopped, she wouldn't have the courage to go on. "This marriage wasn't an accident," Priya said. "Vassal arranged it years ago. Your father's debt?" She looked at Cora. "It wasn't an accident. Ray set the trap. Ray himself years ago pushed your father into those loan shark debts, step by step, until he was drowning in them at exactly the moment Vassal needed him to be." Cora's whole body went cold. Her father. The little shop, the mountain of debt that had driven her all the way here. All of it had been arranged. "This was the plan," Priya went on, her voice lowering. "Push a debtor's family into Fontaine's line of sight, so Jonah would choose that girl as a bride to repay the debt. A clean bride from outside this world, someone no one would suspect. And then use her as the weakness, as the path into the very heart of the Fontaine house. You were supposed to be Vassal's weapon, Cora. You were planted here to destroy him from the inside, without even knowing it yourself." The room seemed to sway around Cora. She reached out and gripped the edge of the desk. She looked at Jonah, and he was looking at her, and in that moment she could read everything moving through his mind. That the man who was used to seeing everything like an equation was now calculating from the beginning again, rearranging every piece, realizing that the marriage he had believed he chose himself had in fact been laid out by his enemy for him to walk into. "Why are you betraying Vassal?" Jonah asked Priya, his voice cold. "Because he'll kill me," Priya answered plainly. "When this is over, he'll clean up every loose end, and I'm a loose end. I've done enough terrible things in my life, but I don't want to die for a plan that used an innocent girl as a knife." She looked at Cora, and for the first time, her eyes were no longer cold. "You didn't deserve to be turned into that," she said. "No one does." Silence fell over the room, thick and heavy, and then Jonah did something that startled both Priya and Cora. He laughed. A quiet, bitter laugh, almost soundless. "So he lost," Jonah said. Cora looked at him, not understanding. "He put you here to destroy me," he said, and his voice softened as he looked at her. "He calculated everything except one thing. He didn't calculate that I would feel something real. He built a trap out of a human being, and that human being became the only thing that made me want to live more decently. He planted you here to kill me, Cora. Instead, you saved a part of me I thought had died long ago." His perfect trap broke, because he could never believe that what existed between us might be real. Cora stood there, tears rising in her eyes, caught between the brutal truth about the source of her whole life and something else even greater, that what had grown between her and Jonah, even though it had been planted in soil thick with lies, was still real. It had always been real. Vassal struck faster than anything they had anticipated, because he knew he had been exposed, and a cornered animal was always the most dangerous kind. The call came at daybreak. Cora was asleep when Jonah shook her awake, his face drawn tight in a way she had never seen before, and she knew something had happened even before he managed to speak. "Your father," he said. "They took him." The whole world seemed to pull every bit of air out of Cora's lungs. Her father, the half-paralyzed man sitting in that little shop in Bensonhurst, the man so frail he couldn't cross a street by himself. They had taken him to pressure Jonah, to force him to hand over his territory in exchange for the life of an old man. In the panic, while Jonah's men rushed back and forth and calls erupted throughout the house, an old piece of the puzzle suddenly dropped into place inside Cora's mind. The watch repair shop. The strange customers who came at night, knocked 3 times, left small packages, and went away. She had told Jonah about it as though it were a harmless scrap of childhood memory. But now, standing in the middle of this storm, she saw it through different eyes. She turned to Jonah. "My father's shop," she said, her voice trembling. "The people who came at night. They weren't customers leaving watches, were they? Jonah looked at her for a long time before answering, and in that hesitation she already had her answer. My father used places like your father's shop, he said quietly. Small, discreet places no one paid attention to, places where he could store things he didn't want kept in the house. I don't know for certain whether your father's shop was one of them, but after hearing what you told me, I suspected it. Cora stood motionless, and a new and painful truth slowly came into focus. Her father, the man she had always thought of as nothing more than a gentle victim of debt, a poor old man swept into a current beyond his control, had known about this world for a very long time, had been tied to it in ways he had never told her. The person she had fought so hard to protect had been hiding more from her than she had ever imagined. And then her phone rang, her father's number. Cora snatched it up, pressed it to her ear, and her father's voice came through, trembling, exhausted, but alive. Cora, he said, is that you, Papa? She broke into sobs. Are you all right? Did they do anything to you? I'm all right, Walter said, though his voice said otherwise. Listen to me first. Sweetheart, I don't have much time. There was a pause, and then his voice broke. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for all of it. I let you carry debts that were never yours. I signed that agreement. I let them take you away in exchange for saving this old body of mine and that useless little shop. I sold you, Cora. I called it having no other choice, but the truth is I was afraid, and I was a coward, and you were the one who had to pay the price for my fear. Papa, don't say that, Cora sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Listen to me until I'm finished, Walter said, and his voice suddenly steadied, the voice of a man saying the most important thing of his life. You deserve a life where you don't have to carry your father's debt. You deserve to live for yourself, to finish the craft you dreamed of, to love someone because you want to, not because of a contract. Don't let my life become one more debt weighing on your shoulders. If you have to choose, choose yourself. Promise me, Papa, she whispered, unable to promise. I love you, Cora. I've always loved you, even when I was too cowardly to let you see it. Then the line went dead, and Cora stood there with the silent phone pressed to her ear, her shoulders shaking, and when she lifted her eyes to Jonah through the blur of tears, he didn't see the despair of a victim waiting to be rescued. He saw something else hardening inside her chest, a cold and sharpened resolve, and she wiped her tears with the back of her hand and said, in the same direct voice that had brought her this far, all right, now tell me everything you know. I'm not going to sit still and wait. While Jonah's men searched the entire city and still couldn't find Walter, Cora sat down with what she had, not guns, not men, but the only weapon she had ever truly mastered, a mind accustomed to numbers. She made Jonah give her everything he had on Vassal, from the protection files she had read to the financial papers his people had dug up. She spread it all across the table in the attic room, and she read for hours, the way she had once read the inner workings of watches, searching for whatever was misaligned, whatever had fallen out of rhythm. And she found it. Vassal owned a tangled web of real estate through dozens of shell companies. But among that maze of figures there was one place that didn't fit. A warehouse on the north side of the city that the books listed as vacant. Yet it was still steadily consuming electricity and water every month. A small number everyone else had overlooked except someone used to reading tiny discrepancies. An empty place doesn't use electricity, Cora said, tapping her finger on the page, and Jonah's face tightened when he understood. Unless it isn't empty, unless someone is being held there and needs to be fed, needs light, needs guards. That's where they're hiding my father. Jonah looked at her, and in his eyes there was something almost like astonishment, the look of a man who had just watched the woman he loved do what an entire army of his men had failed to do. I'll go, he said, and began giving orders. But it would take hours to prepare, to make certain, to avoid putting Walter's life in even greater danger, and during those hours of waiting, stretched tight as a wire, Cora sat alone in the attic room, her hands trembling beyond her control. She needed something to do, something for her hands, the way she always had whenever the world felt too large for her strength. Her eyes fell on her mother's pocket watch, lying on the piece of felt beside the window, the watch that had been dead for years and that she had never once managed to repair. She drew it closer, put on her magnifying loupe, and began doing what she had done 100 times before, removing the back cover, taking out the movement, each tiny gear one by one, letting that familiar rhythm soothe the panic inside her into silence. But this time, when she lifted the movement from the case, she noticed something she had never seen in all those years. The back of the watch case was thicker than it should have been. There was a false bottom, a tiny hidden compartment between the outer casing and the movement, made with such precision that only a true watchmaker who dismantled it all the way down could have discovered it. Cora's heart began to pound. She took a small pair of tweezers, carefully pried up the false bottom, and inside, wrapped in a piece of cloudy film paper, was a tiny roll of film, an old strip of microfilm, the kind people used to shrink whole files of documents onto a piece of film the size of a fingernail. She sat frozen, the roll of film resting in her palm. "This watch belonged to your grandfather," her mother had once said, and then another time she had said someone had left it with her father for safekeeping long ago. Now Cora understood. It had never belonged to her family. It was one of the packages brought to the shop at night, with 3 knocks on the door, left behind and carried away from. Jonah's father had hidden this at her father's shop years ago, in a small, discreet place no one would suspect, perfectly safe, and then he had been shot to death in a parking lot before he could tell anyone where it was. All these years, that clue had lain silently inside a broken watch on her work table, following her from the little shop all the way to this house, and no one, not even Vassal with all his schemes, had known it existed. Cora sprang to her feet, the roll of film clenched tightly in her hand, and ran to find Jonah because she knew, somehow she knew with absolute certainty, that what she had just found in her hand could change everything. Jonah's men were able to read the microfilm within an hour, and what they found left the entire room holding its breath. It was the file Jonah's father had spent years collecting on Victor Vassal. Every filthy deal, every illegal stream of money, every name and date, enough to put Vassal behind federal bars for the rest of his life without needing a single bullet. Jonah's father had hidden it away as insurance, a knife held to his enemy's throat, then taken the secret of where it was hidden with him into the grave, and now it was in his son's hands. But at the same time, Vassal called, and he gave his terms. He didn't know about the microfilm, but he knew about Walter, and he wanted a trade. The old man's life for Fontaine territory, an exchange at the very north side warehouse Cora had found, at midnight, and this was the cruel part. To save Walter, Jonah had to go there and face Vassal, but the only certain way to bring Vassal down without bloodshed was the microfilm, a thing that only had power if it was handed directly to the federal authorities, not carried into an exchange in the dark, where it could be stolen, destroyed, turned useless. He could take the evidence with him to bargain and risk losing it, or he could keep the evidence safe and walk into the trade empty-handed. He couldn't have both. "I'll go bring your father back," Jonah told Cora. His voice returned to that familiar coldness, the coldness of a man about to do something brutal. "I'll take my men, and I'll end this with Vassal. The way this world ends things." Cora caught his arm. She understood what he meant. She understood that in the world he had grown up in, a man like Vassal was dealt with only one way, and that if Jonah walked into that warehouse with that intention, he would walk out with blood on his hands again, and this time it might be blood that could never be washed clean. "No," she said. He looked at her. "I decide," she said, repeating the very words he had given her so many times, and this time she claimed that right back. "You go save my father. That's tonight's task, getting my father out of there alive. But you don't take the film, and you don't end this the way you're thinking, because if you do, you'll win tonight, but you'll become exactly the thing you've feared all your life. I didn't marry the monster people talk about. I won't let you turn into him just to save my father. Believe there's another way. Believe me." Jonah looked at her for a long time, and something inside him, something that had been drawn tight for 37 years, slowly eased. The rescue unfolded in darkness and chaos, and Cora would never know everything that happened inside that warehouse that night, only that Jonah's men got Walter out, trembling but alive, and that in the middle of that struggle, Ray Doyle himself finally showed his face, standing beside Vassal, the traitor at last forced to stand on the side he had chosen long ago. There was a fight. There were moments when Cora held her breath waiting for news, but when everything settled, there was no bloody ending of the kind this world had always known. Because Jonah chose another path, he let Vassal live, and the next morning he handed the microfilm, along with everything his father had collected, to the federal agents who had been quietly investigating Vassal for years. He brought down his enemy not with a bullet in the dark, but with the truth laid bare in the light, in a way his father would never have understood. and in a way that broke the cycle that had swallowed his family for generations. Vassal was arrested within 1 week, and for the first time in 8 years, Jonah Fontaine walked out of a war with clean hands, because the woman in borrowed shoes had shown him there was still another road, and had trusted him enough to make him choose it. Spring came slowly to the city, and 6 months had passed since that wedding night, with the borrowed shoes and the trembling steps across the cold stone floor. Cora had changed, and she knew it, not in a way she could always see, but in the way she felt herself inside a space, in the way she moved through this house as though it belonged to her, in the way she sat down at the dining table and spoke with anyone without cold sweat sliding down her spine the way it had during those first weeks. Her father had gradually recovered, moved into a small quiet house near the sea, partly cleared when the truth about what Vassal and Ray had done slowly came into the light, and for the first time in years, he was able to sleep through the night. That morning, Cora was sitting in the attic room, where sunlight poured in as warm golden streaks, when Jonah came up to find her. "The contract is almost over," he said, standing at the threshold with that hesitant look she now understood as the sign of the things that mattered most to him. "The original agreement was for 1 year. In 6 more months it ends. By then, the debt will be erased, your father will be safe, and you'll be free. You can leave and nothing will stop you." Cora stood, walked over to him, and saw the fear he was trying to hide. The fear of a man who had given away too much and didn't know whether he would be allowed to keep anything. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He went still. "I'm not saying this because I feel I owe you," she continued, her voice steady and gentle all at once. "I'm saying it because it's the truth, and I want you to have the true version of everything, exactly the way you gave me the truth from the beginning. This is home. You are home. I realized it about 3 months ago, and I was only waiting for the right moment to say it." Jonah looked at her for a long time, and then that smile appeared, the full smile, the whole smile. The one Teddy had once said looked almost frightening because it showed up so rarely, and now it bloomed without any attempt to hide it. "I love you," he said simply, without stumbling this time. "I've loved you since the night I sat writing that list. The night I tried to think about the things that frightened you and realized I didn't want you to be afraid, not as a duty, but because it truly mattered to me. It only took me months to find the words to say it." She set her hand on his chest, where his heart was beating, and smiled through her tears. On the work table by the window where her mother's pocket watch lay there, and this time it was running, its hands moving steadily, its soft ticking filling the room, alive again after so many years of silence. The thing that had seemed worthless having carried inside it, the key that saved both families, and saved the part of Jonah's humanity he had thought was long gone. He was slowly withdrawing from the old world, one step at a time, moving what he could into the light, rebuilding his empire on a foundation their children would never have to be ashamed of someday. Catherine had come to visit, and this time she embraced Cora, a brief, tight embrace, and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for giving him back to me." They stood together beside the window, in the early spring sunlight, and outside, the last of the snow was finally melting on the rooftops, and everything that had once seemed vast and terrifying about this life suddenly became small enough to fit inside one room with 2 people and a ticking watch. The story of Cora and Jonah, deep beneath its surface of power and danger, is the story of something very simple that we sometimes forget, that no one is defined entirely by the worst thing they have ever done, that every person, no matter how cold or wounded, still deserves to be seen in both their light and their darkness, and that real love isn't closing your eyes to what is wrong, but having enough courage to look straight at a person, believe in the good that still lives inside them, and give them a reason to choose a kinder path. Kindness can break even the darkest cycles, and sometimes the precious thing, the thing that saves an entire life, lies hidden in the small and familiar things we unknowingly pass by every day. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share the video, so we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Cora and Jonah's story? What part of their journey moved you the most? Leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always waiting to hear what you want to say. Thank you for staying until the very final moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have good health, a joyful life, peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.